The British Armed Forces require a significant increase in funding to counter threats posed by Russia. That's the message from a British parliamentary panel called the Commons Defence Committee. It warned Prime Minister Theresa May to raise military spending by a substantial percentage of the country's gross domestic product if she wants to prevent British forces from becoming outgunned by Russia. The committee claimed a shortage of vehicle-mounted anti-tank weapons and serious deficiencies in the quantities of armour, armoured vehicles and artillery were key areas in which Britain was falling behind Russia. The UK also needed to improve its cyber-terrorism defences, expand its anti-submarine warfare capacity and develop a Royal Navy carrier group capable of protecting the new Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers. Politicians claim the British public are not safe from the threat of Russia unless there is a big increase in military spending. They allege that, without that extra funding, the population remain exposed to a renewed threat from Russia and increasing challenges from terrorism, extremism and cyber warfare. Should military funding be increased? And how much of a threat does Russia really present to the United Kingdom? Simple questions with important answers. Brexit, the rise of homelessness, the underfunding of public services, and the immigration crisis are only some of the current issues facing the UK. Does the Russian threat have a priority in comparison to all the issues currently facing the country? We asked the public here in London. Here's what they said.
I do think it is a waste of money to put, for this government to spend a lot of their budget on weapons when there are a lot of other issues that I think are more important.
It's not one to be overly focused upon necessarily. The funding could definitely be spent elsewhere to help within the country rather than just focusing it entirely on the Russians.
I don't think that a Russian coup is going to be an issue. I think that, if it all comes to it, then as a country we'll band together as we always have. Throughout the time of different wars and such, we've always sort of come together and done what we can to stick together and make us all better.
It's not that it's not a risk, but it's not not high up compared to what's going on in the Middle East and everything else like that.
I just don't see why it's that much in Russia's interest to threaten us.
I think the Russian threat is absolute nonsense. The main threat to world peace that we're facing is coming from America, and it always has done. Certainly since post-war.
We're heading back into a Cold War type era. You got embargoes, you got trade wars, and we're not in a good place at the moment.
I don't think it has a priority, but it's certainly something we've got to take into consideration after many years when the Soviet Empire collapsed and everybody thought the world was at peace. You now see a resurgent Russia, and Vladimir Putin wants to spend trillions on arms. We just can't sit back and go back to the good old bad old days.
I feel personally that we should be looking at home issues, and whilst it is a threat, I think we should be concerning ourselves with a lot more of our issues at home.
I think perhaps it's slightly overblown. It's not perhaps as prevalent as people like to make it out. I feel like the other issues you've mentioned are a bit more immediate to the British public personally.
I think there's a sort of strange kind of fantasy being projected here that by, I guess, sections of the establishment, some of the media, to say that, the real concern that British people face is the possibility of some sort of aggression from Russia. I don't think this is very high on anyone's agenda, given some of the things you mentioned, but given the state of the welfare system in Britain, the massive cuts there have been to local council funding, for example, which is really impacting on people's lives on a daily basis. So that's one thing. I think people are, yes, they're worried about Brexit, they're worried about jobs, they're worried about the state of the National Health Service. I think that's what the polling would tell you, that Russia as a threat to everyday life in Britain is way down that league table.
The biggest overarching threat facing the United Kingdom is how it's going to survive after Brexit. Most of those problems are going to become economic. Britain has to pay her way in the world, she has to find new markets, and the economy has to function. Add to that the fact that we're coming from a period of austerity. Now, against all of that, the issue of the threat Russia poses has got to be a low level of priority. However, Russia is useful in that it's a unifying force, because if the government can demonstrate that Russia is a threat, it's something that will help pull the country together.
The UK is a main contributor to NATO's long-running military build-up on Russia's western borders. What are the public's thoughts about that?
There's a lot of examples. If you look at Turkish Cyprus and Greek Cyprus, there's so much money that's spent on that sort of wall and the blockade, and anywhere where there's a divided city, I just think it makes the relationship much worse. So I think I'm really a sort of pacifist where don't build walls, build negotiation skills and places where people can actually sit down at a table and talk.
You don't want it there at all, but you need to be able to show that NATO is together, it is one, and they are prepared to take action if Russia was to finally push all guns blazing.
To an extent, I think it might just be because of, putting in defences to prevent anything happening.
Well, it'd be good for, whether it be, the United Kingdom or somebody in Europe to help pay some of the share that America mainly pays.
I suppose someone has decided that that's a good place for our military expenditure to go, and that person hopefully knows what they're doing, so yeah.
The main threat isn't coming from Russia. It's a manufactured delusion to try and frighten people. And Britain's been wasting God knows how much on Trident, which is wasting money. What's the point of trying to defend Britain against the Russians when it's being destroyed by neoliberalism?
To contribute to safety is something we have to do, yes, absolutely.
We spend 2% of our GDP. From what I gather, there's a 20 billion black hole in defence spending after many years of cutbacks and cutbacks. And as I say, with the insurgence of Russia, NATO have had to shore up the eastern wall. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia all gained their independence and freedom and wanted democracy. We've got to help them.
Feels like it's worth having a cooperative effort. It's going it alone is maybe not as wise, but having a group of people who are protecting each other, I think, is a good thing to have.
The movement east of NATO is one of the most kind of dangerous and destabilising trends in geopolitics over the last few decades. I mean, it was promised to the Russian leadership soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union that this wouldn't happen. It was quite an explicit promise from the US government at the time that the NATO wouldn't move further east. Since then, since the early 90s, there's been, I think, 13 Eastern European countries have been brought into NATO. Now, that's a real problem because it definitely creates a sense of threat and fear amongst the Russian, I don't know about the people, but definitely amongst the Russian elites. And so I think it's contributing to an increase in tension and the possibilities of great power warfare.
Item that casts the long shadow over all these decisions is the fact that Britain is going Brexit. So, because Britain is going Brexit, it now needs NATO more than ever. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that actually the British population was manipulated into voting for Brexit, and that by splintering Europe, Putin actually ups his ante, ups his game, feels more secure. There is all evidence to suggest that he's going to maintain that kind of pressure in various other ways. So for these reasons, Theresa May is going to need NATO more than ever. And every club has a price. You don't join a club for nothing. Nobody gets a free pass. She's going to have to pay up.
This military race between Russia and the NATO allies has been going on for decades. Does Russia really pose a threat to the UK? And how? the public said this.
I'm actually on Jeremy Corbyn's side. He said, why are we making such a fuss when no facts have, you can't scapegoat someone when you don't have the full information. So I think it was a huge mistake of Britain to make all this big drama before they only had it. You've got to have the educated, all the information, all the facts before making a decision.
Right now, no, but a few years down the line could well do, and as much as we do have our defences around, and there's the talk back and forth about the finances of it.
Not imminently, no. I think maybe down the road a little bit, but who knows? Let's see what President Trump does.
I don't know if it's necessarily to the West, but I mean he's picking off the weaklings where he can get them, and is weakening the West through meddling in elections and things like that.
I don't think so at the moment. There's no. There's been a lot of rhetoric, obviously, going on, and there's been, I suppose, military stuff going on in Crimea and all that stuff. But no, I don't think there's any real risk of an actual sort of military blow-up going on.
The main threat is coming from elsewhere. The main threat that we're suffering from is neoliberalism. It's disgusting, it's insidious, and it's persistent.
I think it's not like the old Cold War threat. It's more cyberspace technology and infiltration.
They've got millions of men in arms, nuclear weapons, more than some populations of countries. So it's going back 30 years. It's not our doing, it's theirs.
Not physically, militarily, but certainly there's a cyber threat which is well documented, and I think that, for personally speaking, I think that's where the biggest threat would come from.
I don't know what other way they would, because I don't think nuclear threat is very realistic.
I don't think Russia does pose a threat to the UK. I don't think there's a blind chance that there's going to be any kind of military aggression by Russia on Britain. I mean, there's all the talk about the internet's interventions and so forth. Some of it may be true, some of it may be exaggerated, but that is in a completely different order of things to the possibility of missiles, bombs, tanks, invading armies coming across the channel, through Europe. It's just not a possibility. And so the kind of Russophobia that is being generated, I think, is a fantastical thing. It's a figment of the imagination. Presumably, in some circles at least, it's deliberately being fostered, and it doesn't actually relate to the reality of geopolitics at all.
I think Russia has to see the United Kingdom as a threat. Any country outside the former Warsaw Pact countries are a threat. And the psychology of a nation like Russia is not the same as the psychology of the United Kingdom. Britain hasn't been invaded since 1066. All her wars were fought abroad. The Russians have a long and nasty memory of fighting mano a mano, hand to hand, on their own soil. Even the Americans don't know what this feels like. And so the Russians will do anything they need to do to keep the threat as far away as possible. Everybody knows it's much better to fight a war on somebody else's land than on your own. And anyway, this won't be a hot war. It'll be a war of cyber warfare. It'll be a war with intelligence, and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, Britain has to be aware, especially following the result on Brexit, that Russia will do what it can to keep her on the back foot.
The recommended increase in military funding is from 2% of gross domestic product to 3%. The government is also advised to maintain the army at a minimum of 82,000 personnel. Theresa May needs to save around £20,000 million a year in other areas to increase military investment by this amount. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia's military spending reached £49.9 billion in 2017 versus the UK's £35.5 billion. So the British government has been encouraged to increase its military budget to counter Russia. But does the public think that military funding should be increased?
The UK could learn a lot from Russia. I think Putin is amazing. I mean, he talks a lot of sense a lot of the time. He's quite rational, he's quite sane.
A touch, just enough to keep the people in work more than anything else, because like with everything else with Rolls-Royce and that going down, it's affecting the local economies everywhere, and you don't want that at all. So you need the expenditure there to keep us going, keep our defences as active as they can be, but not necessarily as much as what they keep wanting it to be.
I think it should be focusing on other things. You know, okay, fine, protect the country if we have, like, if we need to, but in the meantime, why not focus on the NHS, the, you know, education side of it, homelessness?
It would be nice to see other Western democracies, match what America spends on the military to carry their fair share.
I would like some of my money to be spent on military expenditure. I'm aware that there is a need for it.
Every country has a responsibility to have reasonable defences in place. Britain doesn't have. It can't even. It's talking about leaving the European Union, but it doesn't even have a sufficient navy to defend its fishing fleet. I mean, it's a joke, except it's not funny.
Now we're heading down this route of leaving the European Union, we're not going to have much funding for anything, to be honest, let alone, NHS is struggling, military is struggling, we're struggling, services are struggling. It's just going to get worse.
We do meet what's required of us in NATO, a minimum of 2%, but I'm sure there are questions over the international aid budget, which at the moment is giving something of 0.7% of GDP, which is 14 billion a year and increasing. And there's money there that can be better spent, I think.
It's hard to say, really, because it's hard to say how much of it is propaganda, both from the UK and from Russia. And there's not that much documentation around what the current budget is, so it's hard to say.
I think, in a way, to spend more would increase the tension.
I don't think the military funding should be increased. I don't think it should be increased at all, because I don't believe that Russia is a military threat to Britain or any of our neighbours. And I think in general, I don't think the military budget should be raised at all, because if you look at what that money, the defence budget has been spent on over the last 2 decades, it has been a series of aggressive interventions in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, all of which have ended in absolute disaster, not just for the people of those countries and the people in the Middle East, but actually much more widely. It's, as well as the human misery they have created, they've massively destabilised the world. They've made it a much more dangerous and volatile place. And, there's almost no region of the world that hasn't been touched by the disaster of the war on terror. So I don't want more money being pumped into a project that is causing such damage across the world.
Brexit is the context within which, I look at these issues. When Britain was part of Europe, it was like operating from a huge aircraft carrier. Britain's footprint on the world was bigger just because it was in Brexit. It was in Europe. Now it goes Brexit, it becomes a small island in the North Sea, all on its own. America is 6,000 miles away. So here's the thing, I don't think that people have thought through. The former kind of days of imperial glory, when Britain saw the world as its oyster, those days, I believe, are gone, and they will never come back. And so Britain has to choose. It has to pick and choose in which parts of the world, in which spheres it wants to exert its influence and cut its military cloth to the extent that it can prosecute and support those spheres of interest. It certainly won't be global, because frankly, we can't, in the United Kingdom, afford to maintain the former kind of round-the-world force de frappe, as the French would call it, that Britain used to have. It just can't afford it anymore. Those days are gone.
It is claimed that Theresa May needs to save around £20,000 million a year in other sectors if she wants to increase military investment to levels only seen immediately after the end of the Cold War. What are the British public's feelings on this?
Wasting a lot of money, I think it's really tragic to actually look at, the psychological reasons why that's happening and why we're scapegoating a country just because, this kind of like James Bond all over again, which I just think is a bit ridiculous, to be honest.
I think there'll be a lot of outcry, especially with promise of 20 billion going into the NHS extra, because if they start taking it out from other budgets within the NHS, then that's going to really kick off both within Parliament and within the public itself. So,
how are we meant to expect the future generations to lead us later on when they haven't got a clue what they're doing to start with?
Seems like you could just throw a couple extra taxes on tourists like us and we'd happily pay it.
On the condition of that being the case, I would probably not be in favour of it, obviously. But then, you can say that about, if you're spending money on literally anything other than health, education and those things. These are obviously things that you need to spend money on, but then there are obviously sometimes other things you need to spend money on.
She's just made a speech where she's claiming the Tories are defending and investing in the NHS. They're out to destroy it. So anything Theresa May says, you have to take with a very big pinch of salt.
The way to get tax revenue back up is from us. They will tax us more and they will introduce cuts across everything, all the other services.
There is, obviously all the military chiefs now are asking for more and more and more. We've got 2 new aircraft carriers coming online. They're going to cost a lot to run and maintain. So she's got to find the money somewhere.
I think when put in such stark terms, I think it sounds like a bad idea.
I personally wouldn't support it, but I don't know if there's another way. Like, apparently if you increase the tax by like 1p or something, you get like billions of dollars.
I don't think that the military budget should be raised. I don't think it's a sensible use of allocation of resources. And I think that the money will be spent on more foreign wars, more bombing of Syria, more bombing of other countries in the Middle East, more threats against China, more troops which are being sent to Afghanistan, the longest war that Britain's been involved in for probably a century, an absolutely disastrous war. We're wasting this money. And it's not just a waste, it's actually generating more problems. So I don't think that's a good idea. And I don't accept, by the way, the idea either that there's a kind of fixed pot of money. One thing that needs to happen in this country is there needs to be an increase in taxes on the corporates, a decrease in tax evasion amongst rich people, an increase, a return towards a much more progressive system of taxation where people who earn over 100,000 a year or into the millions get taxed more of their income. Because there's so many problems for ordinary people in this country. You know, the welfare state, the local services are being ripped apart. And, it's not right that we should transfer money from them to the armed forces. But actually, we need more money spent on the NHS. We need more money spent on the welfare state. We need more money in our schools and in our universities. We need a completely different set of priorities.
Last week, she promised to fund the NHS by an extra 20 billion. At first, we were told it was going to come from the Brexit bounty, or the Brexit dividend. Now it's been explained that actually she's going to have to raise taxation. This thing has received so much coverage in the media that it's going to be difficult to walk away from. Well, she's going to do that. How's she going to do that? And up the budgets on the military as well. Plus, military technology is very, very expensive these days. So again, it goes back to the answer to, my answer to the previous question. Britain's going to have to cherry pick her spheres of influence, where she's going to be strong, so that and back this up with the military wherewithal to be able to prosecute its goals as well as it can. Britain can't have a little bit everywhere. Plus, the army, rather than increasing, has been shrinking for the past few years. So there we have it. You can't have your cake and eat it. You can't have it all. Britain is now, after Brexit, going to have to make the kind of hard choices that it never had to do before because Britain, frankly, had it all. Those days are gone.
In the House of Commons Defence Committee's report, MPs said that failure to finance the military on a sustainable basis made it very difficult to have a long-term defence strategy. They raised the spectre of Russian aggression and claimed Prime Minister May could only protect the British people against it with more investment in submarines, armoured vehicles, big guns, cyber warfare and air defence. So should the UK worry about military funding to face the Russian threat? Or are more domestic problems like poverty and homelessness more important? British politicians can say what they like to the Prime Minister about investing in military capability to combat Russia. But the British public seem more concerned that if the money goes to war, the country could go to pieces.